Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to attach the axles to the chassis on the Bullhead and see if we can get it rolling. Here we go then, step 27, attaching the axles to the chassis. We're going to need 12 M3x6s, the two ball plates, along with the chassis and the two axles. Before we offer the suspension up to the balls on the chassis, it's not a bad idea to add a little bit of grease. We're going to have steel on steel, which isn't great, so the grease is going to help things along. Now we position the axle under the chassis and pop the end of the arm over the ball. To attach it, we use the ball plate behind the ball. It's got a slot in it which we slot over the ball so the holes line up with the 3 in the end of the arm. Now we screw in 3 M3x6s. As usual, do them up just to take up the slack on all 3, then nip them up the rest of the way so it's sitting nice and square. Flip the chassis round and repeat with the other arm so we've got a nicely hinged axle. Next, on the axle and the chassis, we need to clip the rod end of the steering linkage onto the servo saver. Now access isn't brilliant, so it is a little bit awkward. Best bet is to twist the rod end so it's on the side of the ball, then use some pliers to clip it on. Just be really careful not to damage the plastic. Now, because both the axles fit in the same way, we just need a couple of ball plates and a couple of dozen screws and we'll cut to the rear axle fitted. Very nice. The whole setup is a bit floppy at the moment, so we need to be careful moving it around. All that's stopping the axle dropping all the way down is the steering linkage, so it's best to lift it by the axles just for the time being. Step 28, the dampers. Yes, they really do call them dampers, but I think I would tend to call them bounce enhancers personally. For these we need 8 damper shafts, which are really just long screws with a long shank, 8 flanged M3 nuts, 8 F6s, the top bits, 8 F5s, the bodies, 8 F4s, the bottom bits, and a couple of bits of rubber tube. Also there's the springs of course, which will make an appearance a bit later. First we're going to chop up the rubber tube. Now it's not super critical that we get the lengths perfect, as long as they're pretty close they're going to do the job. Tamiya has a nice diagram that we can use as a cut guide. We just need to hold the tube over the top and get cutting. Of course, if you want to be super accurate, they give 19mm as the length, so you can measure them out. With 8 made, we can start the assembly. We're going to need to make 8 dampers, all of which are the same, so as usual we're going to build just one in the video. Right, the ends of the damper shafts have a regular screw head, so we can use a screwdriver to stop the shaft rotating. Before we insert it into the body, we need a couple of spots of grease, not for performance, but rather just to stop the squeaking. If you leave them dry, they make quite a racket after a couple of runs. Now we insert the shaft into the body, all the way to the bottom, slide one of the rubber tubes over the shaft, thread one of the nuts onto the thread. Now we want the flange towards the bottom, so we're installing the nut upside down. Now we pop the spring over the body and compress it. Next, with the screwdriver firmly in the screw head, we need to thread on the F4 on the bottom so it's right tight against the nut. All that's left is to clip one of the top bits onto the top of the body, and that's the bounce enhancing damper complete. They really are terrible things, but if you want to experience the Bullhead in all its bouncy glory, you have to run the truck with them at least once. We just need to make another 7, and that's step 28 done. Step 29, fitting the dampers to the chassis. For this one we need 8 M3x27s, 8 flanged M3 nuts, 8 3mm washers and 8 little brass tubes. This is all quite simple. All we do is pop one of the brass tubes over the screw, then pass it through the top of a damper. Follow that with a washer, which is rather important. If you miss the washers, the brass tubes can be pulled into the plastic, causing damage. Pop the thread through one of the middle holes and flip the chassis over. Now we just thread on a nut and nip it up. At the bottom we've got a ball cup and a ball to clip together. Now access isn't great on the inside ones, so we have to be extra careful. I found pressing these ones on with the end of a pair of pliers went easier than trying to squeeze them on. Once clipped in, that's a damper fitted, and there's just 7 more to go. And there we go. They're pretty awful with no damping, but they do look okay. They continue the yellow theme quite nicely. Step 30, time for electronics, the ESC. For screws, all we need is 2 M2x8s and 2 M2 washers. Other than that, we need the TEU 106BK dual motor ESC. It's nothing special, literally just your bog standard ESC with an extra set of motor leads connected in parallel. It'll make wiring far easier than messing with Y leads though. The original kit came with a wiring harness and a power economy switch that was a bit of fun. It changed the motor wiring between parallel and series. Of course, everyone just kept it in power mode, so it was a bit redundant. Right, in this step we need to fit the switch to the chassis, so we need to remove the 2 screws from the switch as it comes out the box, so we can use the longer ones. We need to offer up the switch behind the hole on the right side of the chassis and install the 2 silver screws with the washers under the heads. Nip them up and that's the switch in. Next we have the motor wires. Now each motor needs a yellow and a blue wire for the ESC. It doesn't matter which ones as they're connected together inside. So with the front motor we connect yellow to yellow and blue to green because the front motor runs in the normal forward direction. At the back though we need to connect the motor up the other way, yellow to blue and green to yellow, so the motor runs backwards. The bullet connectors are pretty bad but standard on brushed RC. Make sure they go in all the way. They're supposed to kind of click into place, but more often than not they just don't fit that well. Step 31, the electronics tray. We need 4 3x12 self-tappers and an A7, the tray. Okay, the tray has a slot on one side for the wires to pass through, so we need to position everything so it's all nice and neat. We need the motor wires to come up from the bottom, and as I'll discover in a minute, probably the steering servo lead too. Position everything and place the tray down on the top of the chassis, being careful not to pinch any wires. Then install the screws in the outer holes. You might find you need to twist the chassis a little bit to get the holes to line up. Just look down the holes and adjust as necessary. Now before we stick down the ESC in the radio, we're going to give the surface that we're trying to stick to a good wipe down with some IPA on a cloth to get rid of any grease. Now we use some of the servo tape from the kit to stick them down. Just a square under each will do. Now the tray has all the mountings for the old mechanical speed control and receiver battery, so places to stick the modern electronics aren't ideal. The manual has us place the ESC where the receiver used to go, which will work okay. For the receiver, we're going to put it where the mechanical speed control went. The steering servo can plug into channel 1 and the ESC plugs into channel 2. Turn and burn, as they say. Now we could power up the electronics now to give it a test, but being mostly Tamiya stuff, I'm confident it's going to work straight away, so I think we'll risk it and just move on. Step 32, tyres. For this one, we need the tyres and wheels. Now, if you're only ever going to drive around on a flat surface, you can just fit the tyres and go for it. But if you're going to go off-road and maybe try and pull things and do wheelies, you're going to want to glue the tyres to the wheels. There are special tyre glues, but I always just use a thin cyanoacrylate. It needs some care to use safely, but you always end up with a well-stuck tyre. The difficult bit here is getting the wheels inside the tyres. The rubber's pretty hard and it doesn't stretch. We need to get the wheels in so the tyre beads are perfectly seated all the way around on both sides. It can be helpful to use a chunky screwdriver, a bit like a tyre iron, to get things in position. There really isn't a shortcut here, you just have to keep going and persevere. Make up all 4, being sure to make 2 left and 2 right hand wheels. It's a right pain having to undo one if you end up with 3 left ones. Next we peel the bead up just a little bit so we can get the nozzle on the cyanoacrylate in. Then squirt a little in the gap. Thin cyano is a bit like water, so we're not going to need a vast amount. It'll run around the bead almost instantly. A quick massage isn't a bad idea, and then leave it for 30 minutes to dry. It's best to do one side at a time so the fresh glue is at the top. Otherwise, if the glue's at the bottom, if there's any excess it can find its way out and stick the tyre to the bench, which isn't so good. Okay, step 33, hex adapters and battery cap. We're going to be needing 2 3x8 self-tappers, 4 M4 flange nylock wheel nuts, 4 brass hex adapters, and for plastic we need an A4, the battery cap, C9, the spacer, and 4 B5 hubs. All we need to do with the end cap is insert the spacer so it lines up with the holes. Then screw in the 2 self-tappers from the outside. Nip them up and that's the end cap ready for the next step. For the hubs, we pop one of the hex adapters on the spline shaft, slide the plastic hub over the top, offer up a wheel lining up the nubs on the inside with the holes on the hubs, and thread on one of the nuts. Rinse and repeat 3 more times and we have a chassis on its wheels, which is now far too big for the camera angle, so let's reposition. Yeah, that's looking far more like a monster truck now. I think it's looking pretty good. Step 34, the battery. Now we're going to use a 6L 9mm with a Tamiya connector just for the time being, as it's going to be a direct fit. The battery slides in through the chassis with the wires outwards. Then the plug goes through the slot in the battery cap, which clips into the side of the chassis. As a solution it works, but it's not really the nicest to look at. Before we plug it in, we're going to lift the axles up off the bench with a couple of boxes. We should really have tested it before putting the wheels on, just in case it takes off, but I'm fairly sure we're going to be okay with this setup. Now we turn the transmitter on, which is already bound to the receiver. Refer to your radio's manual for info on that. Plug the battery into the ESC, hold the chassis with one hand, and we turn the ESC on with the other. Well, we got the motor beeps and it didn't take off by itself, so I think we're pretty safe. Well, the steering looks okay. We'll probably need to adjust the end points and maybe the linkage lengths a little to get everything set up just so, but it's good enough for starters. The throttle seems okay too, so I think we're on to a winner. Right, just for fun, let's pop the body on, which of course looks a little bit ridiculous, maybe a bit silly, but that's pretty much the whole point of the Bullhead. Next time we'll assemble all the bits on the body. There's lots of chrome with the usual Tamiya fit and finish, so that should be fun. For this week though, that's about it. So as always, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!